I lived in a small apartment when I was in my early 20s because I didn't have much money at the time, and since I lived alone, there was no one with whom I could share a larger apartment. My building was small, with a total of 6 apartments. Most of the people who lived in that building were retired and didn't like to talk. To tell the truth, I actually liked the fact that I didn't have to interact with anyone every time I entered or left the building. I am usually a hurried person and almost never in the mood to socialize. I lived on the top floor, and in the apartment in front of mine, there was an old couple who lived there for almost 2 years until they moved out. I never talked to them, so I didn't care much when they left. To be honest, several months passed before a new person moved into the apartment in front, and it took 2 more weeks before I met my new neighbor. One morning, while I was getting ready for work and preparing my lunch, I suddenly heard the neighbor's door open. I didn't pay much attention to it until another minute passed, and I realized that I didn't hear the door closing. I finished getting ready, put on my shoes, and then opened my door to leave. Immediately, I noticed that the neighbor's door was still open, and a tall man in his 50s was standing in front of the door staring at me. He smiled and introduced himself, and I made a fake smile and told him my name. Then I said that I had to go to work and started walking. As soon as I reached the staircase, he invited me to have breakfast with him. This was very strange since I had just told him that I had to go to work. I simply excused myself and kept walking. While I was at work that day, I thought about how strange that interaction had been. Fortunately, when I got home from work, I managed to get into my apartment without having to talk to anyone. But the next morning, I woke up to a knock on my door. I was very annoyed because I had to work later, and now I had woken up very early. But I quickly put on my clothes and walked to the front door. My neighbor was there, but strangely he was standing right in front of his open door again, just like he had done the day before. He invited me again to have breakfast at his apartment. I obviously refused, and this time I told him more aggressively not to knock on my door so early. The man didn't seem to like my response, and he stood there staring at me. Then he said that since it was an earlier time, I didn't have to go to work yet, so I had plenty of time to have breakfast with him. That was really weird. After all, I had just told him that I had to go to work. I simply excused myself and continued walking. During work that day, I kept thinking about how strange that interaction had been. Thankfully, when I got home from work, I was able to enter my apartment without having to talk to anyone. But the next morning, I woke up to a knock on my door. I was very irritated because I had work later, and now I had woken up very early. But I quickly put on my clothes and walked to the front door. My neighbor was there, but strangely, he was standing right in front of his open door again, just like he had done the day before. He invited me again to have coffee in his apartment. I obviously declined, and this time I told him in a more aggressive tone not to knock on my door so early. The man did not seem to like my response, and he stood there staring at me. Then he said that because of the earlier time, I did not have to go to work yet, so I had enough time to have coffee with him. I knew there was something wrong with this man since that response was very strange. I firmly refused his invitation, and then I went back and closed my door, making sure it was locked again. The more I thought about this man, the stranger and scarier this interaction seemed to be. Despite that strange morning, the rest of that day passed normally. I got home at 6 p.m. Good afternoon, I prepared my dinner and watched a movie, and I got ready for bed at 11 o'clock at night. I lay on my bed for a while, thinking about my weird neighbor. I was thinking about what I should do in that situation. I made a decision that if anything else strange happened, I would complain to the building owner. Then I turned off my bedside lamp and tried to sleep. But a few minutes later, I heard my neighbor's door open. I waited silently, trying to hear what my neighbor was doing, but I couldn't hear anything. Again, I didn't hear his door close. I was nervous not knowing what that man could be doing so late at night, but eventually, I fell asleep since I hadn't heard any other noise for an entire hour. I don't know how long I slept before a loud knock on my door woke me up. But those knocks weren't coming from my front door, they were coming from my bedroom door. I jumped out of my bed, completely scared. And then I turned on my bedside lamp. The only thing I could use to defend myself was a small screwdriver that was on the table next to my bed. I took the screwdriver and stood by my bed, trembling with fear. Then I grabbed my phone to call the police. When the police arrived at my front door, I quickly left my room and went to open the door for them. I was surprised that the front door wasn't even closed, but I told the police everything. I told them about my suspicions of my neighbor. But unfortunately, there was no evidence to prove that my neighbor had invaded my apartment, and the police couldn't do anything. Regardless, I knew what I had heard was real and I no longer felt safe in my apartment. I called my sister that day and she let me stay at her apartment for a few days. Unfortunately, those days went by too quickly, so I started driving back to my apartment on a Saturday night. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that my neighbor had surely given up at that point and that everything would be fine. I parked my car and started walking towards my building. The sun had just set, so the stairs were dark. I climbed the stairs slowly, trying not to alert my neighbor that I had returned. When I reached my floor, I saw that my neighbor's door was closed, and I felt relieved. I quickly crossed my door and locked it. I dropped my suitcase in the hallway and turned on the lights as I turned the corner of my hallway towards my bedroom. I screamed and jumped back because the man was sitting right on my couch, staring directly at me with a wide, horrible smile. I ran out of the building and got into my car, then called the police again and waited for them in a parking lot near my building. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, we went to my building and they went into the apartment while I waited near my car. To my surprise, they came back a few minutes later with the man in handcuffs. They told me that the man was still sitting on my couch and that they had found a small knife in his pocket. But the most disturbing part of this whole situation was that the man admitted to the police that he had broken into my apartment 3 times and I was only aware of 2 times that he had broken in. This means that at some point the man was hiding in my apartment, watching me without me knowing of his presence. For over 2 hours, I walked my dog Luna to tire her out. I got home around 5 p.m. and the sun doesn't set until around 7 p.m. As soon as I got home, I put her on a leash and we went for a walk. The walk was completely normal and Luna, as always, was pulling me in whatever direction she desired. Things only started to get ugly when the sun was almost gone. Unfortunately, I had walked a much greater distance than I had realized. If you take your dog on long walks, you know how easy it is to get distracted, especially if your dog walks very fast. We had started the walk heading in the direction I usually take, but because of the distance, I had reached a street I didn't recognize. However, I still had a good idea of which direction I had to take to get back home. I started turning around to head back home, but Luna refused to walk. She was completely still, and then she started whimpering. It was at that moment, with the little illumination left by the sunset, that I saw a huge wolf staring at us in the middle of the street. It was the size of a big Labrador, its fur was all tangled, and its mouth was partially open, so I could see its disgusting, yellow, sharp teeth. I knew immediately that we were in trouble. I was apprehensive, but for some reason, I thought it would simply go away. I was unfamiliar with this street, but what I knew was that I had to keep walking. As I continued moving, the wolf slowly followed me, but it still kept a certain distance. However, the darker it got, the more scared I became, and after walking in the darkness on this unknown street for some time, I came to the terrible conclusion that I was lost. All the turns I had taken had messed up my sense of direction, and I no longer knew which direction to walk in. As I walked through these dark streets every few minutes, I could see the beast's shining eyes, and I could also hear its low howls and barks. As I walked, more and more pairs of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, and they were getting closer and closer. At this point, I was terrified and could barely hold back my tears as I entered into panic and feared for my life and the life of my dog. Occasionally, I passed by a street light and turned my head to check if they were still behind me. I could see the whole pack of wolves still slowly following me and observing everything I did. After almost 50 minutes of being followed, I was starting to get tired and knew I was still far from the safety of my home. Luna started to cry louder too, which made me even weaker emotionally, as I realized she knew what was about to happen. The low barks and growls became more frequent and louder, getting closer. I turned my head again and saw all those bright eyes staring at me just 10 meters away. But suddenly, in a very strange way, they all began to separate and move to the sides of the street. Then a small car appeared and moved through the pack of wolves and parked right beside me. A woman lowered her car window and asked me if I needed help. I was very grateful, and then I asked her to please take me home. Normally, there is almost no circumstance in which I would get into a stranger's car, but I really had no other choice. The lady in the car seemed nice and scared for my situation. I was crying at this point, knowing I was moments away from being brutally attacked. She kindly dropped me off at my house, which was 20 minutes away from where she picked me up. I live in a great neighborhood, one of those places where you don't have to worry about theft or break-ins. The only issue with my neighborhood and the surrounding areas are the wolves. It's been a few years since this incident happened to me, and as time passed, the wolves started appearing more frequently and getting bigger. The residents in my area know to be cautious, especially in parks where there are many trees and hiding spots for the wolves. Signs have been placed to warn people of the most dangerous areas where multiple wolves have been sighted. Since then, other stories have happened to people who live in this area, such as wolves jumping fences to grab smaller dogs, and even larger animals have been spotted completely missing, such as children's pet pigs. These are very sad and some of them are even scary stories, but you never think of wolves as a real danger to humans until you are being followed in the middle of the night by a pack of hungry and merciless wolves. I used to work at my dad's restaurant during my teenage years. It was just a small local restaurant, but it stayed open every night until 2 a.m. During school time, I only worked after school until 8 p.m., but as soon as I graduated, I started working until closing time to save money for college. Surprisingly, the restaurant was busy at night. It was busy until closing time, and at that time, most of the customers were picking up takeout orders. However, occasionally some groups of friends would come and sit at one of the tables to eat. I definitely preferred working at night because I used to be the only person in the restaurant, and I didn't have to listen to my dad complaining to me. After 6 months of working the night shift, things started to get strange. One night, we were almost closing, and I was cleaning in the back when I heard the doorbell ring. I finished what I was doing and went to the front. There were 2 young men who looked very tired. One of them came to the counter while the other stood near one of the tables. I said, "We're closing, but I can still take a small order if you want it to go." The man at the counter just stared at the menu and didn't say anything. I stood there feeling uncomfortable as the man glanced around the restaurant. I used to work at my dad's restaurant during my teenage years. It was just a small local restaurant, but it stayed open every night until 2 a.m. during school time. I only worked after school until 8 p.m., but as soon as I graduated, I started working until the restaurant closed to save money for college. Surprisingly, the restaurant was busy at night, it was packed until closing time. At that time, most customers were ordering takeout, but occasionally some groups of friends would come in and sit at one of the tables to eat. I definitely preferred working at night since I used to be the only person in the restaurant and didn't have to listen to my dad complaining to me. After working the night shift for 6 months, things started to get strange. One night, we were almost closing and I was cleaning in the back when I heard the doorbell make noise. I finished what I was doing and walked up to the front. There were 2 young men who seemed very tired. One of them came up to the counter while the other stood near one of the tables. I said, "We're closing, but I can still take a small order for takeout if you want." The man at the counter just stared at the menu and didn't say anything. I stood there feeling uncomfortable while the man looked away and started inspecting the restaurant. A few seconds later, the man who was at the table quickly walked out of the restaurant and the man at the counter followed him outside. That was definitely one of the strangest encounters I ever had, and I couldn't think of any logical explanation for why it happened. In the morning, I told my dad about the situation and he told me I could start locking the restaurant doors at 1:45 a.m. in the following days. Another week passed and nothing happened. However, one night, a customer was picking up their order at 1:30 a.m. and almost immediately after this customer left, one of the men from that previous night walked into the restaurant. He was the man who had stood next to the table last week, and I immediately noticed that he was wearing the same clothes. However, this time, he came up to the counter, looked directly into my eyes for a few seconds, and then asked if I could help push his car to jumpstart it. The way he said it was very strange and it was very obvious that something weird was going on. So, I told him, I can't leave the restaurant while I'm working. He immediately frowned and got irritated, then he said it would be very quick and no one would notice my absence. At that point, I realized that something was very wrong and I started to panic inside my head. He started walking towards the door, gesturing for me to follow him. I honestly didn't know what to do and was very scared, but my defense instincts were starting to kick in and my adrenaline was rising. I think it's worth mentioning that I'm not a very big guy and this man was much larger than me. Additionally, I was almost certain that the other man outside somewhere was also probably waiting to attack me if I didn't follow orders. But I thought I was screwed either way, so I could at least try to resist and fight. I grabbed a pair of scissors from the counter and held my ground. The man turned to me as soon as he got close to the door. This time, he seemed nervous and began demanding that I follow him right away. A loud noise came from the back of the restaurant. The back door had been opened forcefully. I ran to the back with the scissors in my hand, and the man who had opened the door ran out as soon as he saw me. I quickly turned and ran back to the front counter, but the other man had also left. Obviously, I called the police afterwards and gave them the security camera footage, but the quality was poor and it would be very difficult to make any kind of identification. Anyway, I still don't know why they didn't just attack me and rob the restaurant. My best guess is that they wanted to rob the restaurant without hurting anyone, so as soon as they realized I was ready to fight, they ran. Those two men could have easily taken me down and the situation would have been much worse for me, so I'm glad everything turned out okay.